Hi, everyone, and welcome to Webinar Wednesday. Today, we'll be covering part one of our Audit Trends series. We'll also have a part two in November. Today, we will have Zach Olson and Evan Zarinsky presenting for us. Just a quick disclaimer. The information in this PowerPoint is provided for general information purposes only, and these materials are not intended to provide legal advice. These copyrighted materials may not be reproduced, copied, or used without prior permission from the authors. And I just want to make a couple notes about the webinar format today. Participant phone lines are muted. If you do have questions, please feel free to send an email to news@dciconsult.com. And if you're having any technical difficulties during the call, you can also email that same email address. And then a note for DCI clients, you'll also have access to this presentation through the DCI Client Resources portal in the next few days. You can move on to the next slide. A little bit about DCI. Our mission is advancing workforce equity and organizational effectiveness through our dynamic client partnerships. And our vision is that we believe every person deserves equal opportunity and fair treatment in the workplace and beyond. A little bit about our services. We do all sorts of stuff in the HR compliance space, including OFCCP compliance, DE&I work, pay equity, personnel selection, EEO litigation support, and testing and validation. And I will hand things over to our presenters, Zach Olson and Evan.
All right, thank you, Mitch. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending on where you are, and thanks for being with us today. My name is Zach Olson. I'm excited to be here with my colleague Evan Sorensky to chat through what's been going on in the regulatory environment this year. We have a lot to cover in our short time together, so with that, here's a brief overview of what we're going to cover today. First, we're going to chat through the new compensation directive that was released in August. We're going to talk a little bit about the certification portals that OFCP has rolled out. Evan's going to discuss some audit trends that we've been seeing in recent audits. And then in addition, we're going to talk about the National Academy of Sciences analysis findings on the EEO1 Component 2 data collected by EEOC in 2019. And then lastly, we'll touch on the EEO1 Freedom of Information Act request that I imagine is currently impacting most of you listening to this webinar. Finally, I should note that this webinar is intended to be a part one on audit trends and other regulatory affairs. I will hope that you'll join our colleagues, Cassie Elfheim and Benjamin Kerner, next month for part two, where they'll build upon what we're talking about today and provide additional insight, hopefully on OFCCP's enforcement numbers for the 2022 fiscal year that just ended September 30 of this year. I think that's all we have here. Evan, with that, what's up with this new compensation directive?
Thanks, Zach. So as you probably know, OFCCP released the compensation directive earlier this year to coincide with Equal Pay Day. And that directive was 2022-01. It was titled Pay Equity Audits. And a lot of the contracting community had a lot of questions based on that directive. And some of that, there was confusion. Some of that was based on what OFCCP was talking about in terms of attorney-client privilege. Were they saying that attorney-client privilege did not apply? And so OFCCP said they were going to work on it. And then August 18th, 2022, they issued a revised directive. It's still number 2022-01, but now it's 2022-01 revision 1, and it's titled Advancing Pay Equity Through Compensation Analysis. And it did a number of changes that we'll get into in a second, but it did reaffirm that OFCCP does not require production of attorney-client privileged communications, which is consistent with what DCI's interpretation of it was. So I think it's good to take a step back before we get into the details of the directive. And so the directive is not the law. It's what OFCCP's interpretation of the law is. And the law, that actually binds contractors is the regulation. Any directive cannot actually put new burdens on the contracting community. So let's look at what the regulation says. So the relevant regulation says the contractor must perform in-depth analyses of its total employment process to determine whether and where impediments to equal opportunity exist. At a minimum, the contractor must evaluate, and the relevant part is compensation systems to determine whether there are gender, race, or ethnicity-based disparities. So that is what contractors are required to do, and nothing in the compensation directive changes that. You'll notice that there's not a lot of specifics. Contractors still have a lot of leeway in terms of what they can do in order to evaluate their compensation systems. So getting back to the privilege issue. So OFCCP, or this directive, OFCCP says that they need to verify that contractors are actually doing this in-depth analysis. So in an audit, OFCCP can request the in-depth analysis. If that in-depth analysis is privileged, OFCCP then lays out what the contractor can submit rather than waiving privilege. And so basically, if the contractor has the option of either giving a copy of its analysis, or they can provide an affidavit that lays out 5 items. And so those 5 things are when the compensation analysis was completed, the number of employees that were included, and the number in categories excluded, which forms of compensation were analyzed, and whether different forms were combined into that analysis. So that's the second item. The third item is which forms of compensation were analyzed and how the different forms were separated or combined. The fourth item was the compensation was analyzed by gender, race, or ethnicity, just a statement. And the fifth item is the method of analysis employed by the contractor. Again, there's a wide berth on what that method of analysis can be. Another thing that was set out in the directive was what the contractor needs to produce if that analysis identifies a problem area. So the regulations say contractors need to do an in-depth analysis to identify whether there's problem areas, and then if there are problem areas, they need to take action-oriented programs. And so OFCCP says that there's 5 things that need to be included in those action-oriented programs to show that they're compliant with the regulations. And that would be, first, the nature and extent of any pay disparities found. Second, whether the contractor investigated the reasons for any pay disparities. Third, that the contractor has instituted action-oriented programs to correct the problem area. Fourth, the nature and scope of those problems. And fifth, how the contractor intends to measure the impact of these programs on the equal employment opportunities and identified barriers. So what does this mean going forward? So DCI recommends conducting a regulatory evaluation of compensation systems, either as a part of or in addition to the privileged analysis. And so then this regulatory evaluation can be provided to OFCCP if they request it. But during an audit, contractors should be prepared to provide documentation of the analysis or the affidavit describing the privileged analysis, and documentation of any actions taken regarding problem areas. And now I'm going to turn it over to Zach to talk about the contractor portal.
On mute. Awesome. Thanks, Evan. So I'm sure most of you know on this call This is not new to you, but this past June was the inauguration year, essentially, of OFCCP's contractor portal for supply and service contractors. And so the certification deadline to certify compliance by AEP establishment was June 30th. For most contractors, unless they had recently become a covered federal contractor within the previous 120 days. And so with that in mind, the contractor portal does remain open. And it's actually the intention of OFCP for new contractors to update their certification status as they come into compliance. So if in the event that you haven't certified yet and you're in that situation of being a new contractor or having a new contract, you should still go out and certify. If you haven't certified yet at all, by all means, you should go out and do so. DCI did do a Freedom of Information Act request, though, and found that as of June 30th, the filing deadline, only 44% of covered federal contractors actually went in to the portal and checked one of the three options given. And so that's roughly 10,000 contractors. And when I say contractors, I mean like contractors, not contractor establishments. So there were a lot of folks or of companies that didn't go in and certify. So what happens next? Essentially, what OFCP said is that those who didn't go in and certify are more likely to be on future scheduling lists. But interestingly enough, and we heard this, this past summer, is that they'll also be included on a list to federal procurement officers. And so that is another way that they're kind of expanding their reach here with this certification effort. Evan, I know that OFCP also released another portal related to construction contractors too.
That's right, Zach. So OFCCP recently rolled out the Notification of Construction Contract Award Portal, or NCAP. And this applies only to federal contractors who have construction subcontracts over $10,000. So OFCCP's regulations require that if a contractor lets out a construction subcontract over $10,000, that contractor has to notify OFCCP. So this tip applies mostly to construction contractors, but it is possible in some cases, for a supply and service contractor to have to let out a construction subcontract. So if you don't let out construction subcontracts, you don't have to worry about this requirement. If you do, this is not a new requirement. For a long time, construction contractors have been required to notify OFCCP of these things, but it was normally done by fax, mail, or email. And so this is just a new way to provide these notifications to OFCCP. It also allows for bulk upload, because that was always a problem with submitting by email or mail or fax. Was you might have a lot to submit. So bottom line, this is not anything, a new requirement. All it is a new way to submit this information. You can still do it by fax, mail, or email if you choose to, but this is out there and it's an easier way to submit it. We've also come across some new audit developments over the past fiscal year. So one of the big things is increased coordination in terms of audits. And so the big part of this has been with the new CSAL. So that's the corporate scheduling announcement list. And so OFCCP puts out a list on their website that says who they're going to audit over the next approximately a year. This year with the CSAL, they said any contractor that has 3 or 4 establishments on the list will have all those establishments combined into a single region, regardless of where those establishments sit. So this is new. So let's say there's a construction, or let's say there's a contractor with one establishment in Pacific, one in Southeast, one in Northeast, and one in Midwest. It used to be each of those would be assigned to the respective region. Now they're all going to be consolidated in a single region. The idea behind this is that it will actually streamline things, or this is what OFCCP's idea is. So instead of having where you might get 4 different data requests for the same thing from 4 different offices, now contractors would only get a single request and they could supply that instead of having to do it over and over and over. OFCCP thinks that this will help things process more quickly, and it will actually reduce the burden on contractors because they'll be getting a single request instead of multiple requests. These are just now starting to get scheduled, so it's yet to see whether it actually meets what OFCCP's goal is. Another thing that we're seeing, even aside from the CSAL, is increased coordination both within regions and across regions. So we've seen some regions where they have multiple reviews of a single contractor, kind of forming a team and consolidating that so that they're have like a single point of contact with that contractor, and kind of doing the same thing that they're trying to do with the CSAL, where they're only doing one request instead of requesting this same thing multiple times. There's also increased coordination across regions, where we've seen, we'll get the same, a very similar data request from multiple compliance officers across the country requesting the same thing within like a week or so. And so we can tell that this is happening. And we're still kind of looking to see if this actually is reducing burden. One thing to point out with both of these types of increased coordination, OFCCP is still evaluating each establishment separately. They're doing an evaluation of one establishment, evaluation of a second establishment. They're not combining those and running, compensation analysis on both establishments combined. So it's important to point that out. Another thing that came out this year, that applies to construction contractors, is a change to the compliance evaluation procedures. So in the past, when OFCCP did a full compliance evaluation of a construction contractor, they would send a scheduling letter, and then the next contact would be when OFCCP went on site and did a site inspection of the construction site, and that's where OFCCP would get the data that it needed for the compliance evaluation. Now OFCCP is requesting the data, having it sent in, and then doing a desk audit on that data and going on site if they see issues in the data. So this is kind of moving construction of compliance evaluation procedures closer to where they are for supply and service. One thing to see how this, we're still looking to see how this shakes out, is the resources involved in on-sites for construction. So OFCCP used to be each district office would schedule their own cases, and they typically scheduled work sites that were within the commuting area of the office. So the cost to go on site was either zero or very minimal. With OFCCP's new process, those construction sites can be quite far from the office. I mean, they can be over 100 miles from the office. And so the resources involved in an on-site for travel to go to these on-sites are going to increase. And so we have to see whether that increase in cost is going to impact how many construction cases they can actually go on site for. Another thing that was big in FY22 was an increase in CO count. So OFCCP has been doing a lot of hiring, and that includes hiring of compliance officers. So moving forward into FY23, it's possible that those increased compliance officers will allow OFCCP to start investigating more cases. And another thing, so looking back at FY22, something we saw was OFCCP wasn't investigating as many they weren't doing as many reviews as they did under the previous administration, but the reviews they have do seem to be lasting longer and going into more depth. And the trends with the actual case numbers will be covered in the next seminar in November. So watch out for that. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Zach to talk about the NAS report.
Awesome. Let's hope that the fewer and longer lasting reviews don't last too long. But all right, just a personal anecdote. Well, thanks, Evan. So we want to talk about the EEO1 component 2 data, and I know I don't want to bring up a sore subject for some employers on the line, but as a quick recap, so just to kind of back up, there's a lot of consequences that are still playing out from this data collection that closed 3 years ago already, essentially. And so, as a quick recap, the pay data component of the EEO1 report was actually added in 2016 during the last year of the Obama administration. And then when the Trump administration took over in 2017, they decided to scrap the component 2 filing altogether. Long story short, there was some litigation that happened after they decided to scrap it, and that resulted in a 2019 court order that essentially demanded EEOC collect this data. And thus, the pay data from 2017 and 2018 were collected as part of the EEO1 report component 2 in 2019. So stick with me here. So then in 2020, after the data collection had ended, EEOC asked the National Academy of Sciences to commission a thorough review of the utility and the validity of the data that was collected as part of the component 2 process. And so fast forward to this year in July of 2022, NAS concluded its study and released its findings and recommendations for EEOC. And so what did that report conclude? Well, first, it concluded that component 2 data is a key resource for EEOC's enforcement efforts. The NAS notes that this data collection was the first of its kind at the federal level and could be useful in focusing EEOC's efforts in combating pay discrimination. If we just stop there, it'd be like, uh-oh, it's definitely coming back. We should be ready. But there were issues that were noted, several issues actually, that NAS identified that limit the utility of the data. That includes the use of W2 Box 1 data. They found that the Box 1 data only partially reflects total compensation, and excludes stock options, for example, pre-tax retirement contributions, HSA contributions, etc. There are issues with that. There's the use of artificial pay bands and EEO1 job categories that may not sufficiently describe the modern workforce. The fact that the data that was collected as part of the component 2 with the sex, race, and ethnicity categories, they don't align actually to federal best practices. And then probably most importantly, data on legitimate factors that drive differences in pay outcomes, such as experience, education level, were not collected. And so where does that leave us? Well, I think it's important to say that officially, there's nothing further on the books at this time. However, it seems that EEOC could use this report as a roadmap for the institution of future federal pay data reporting requirements down the road at some point. That will be a long process, and so we'll definitely keep you updated as updates become available in that regard. Evan, you want to round us out today with the EEO1 FOIA request that I'm sure most folks on the line are dealing with right now?
Yes, thanks, Zach. So as you probably know, there was a FOIA request for all EEO-1 reports for federal contractors. Now, this there was a detailed webinar that DCI put out when this first became an issue in August. So I'm just going to run over it, do a summary here, just because the deadline to apply is coming up, or to respond is coming up very quickly. So basically what happened is the Center for Investigative Reporting a few years ago filed for a FOIA request for the Type 2 consolidated report for federal contractors and first-tier subcontractors from 2016 to 2020. Now, the Type 2 consolidated report is different from the Component 2 report that Zach was just talking about. The Type 2 report is the EEO-1 report that has the demographic data for all employees of a multi-establishment employer by race, ethnicity, sex, and job category. So it's just the number of employees, as there's no pay information in this. So reports that are not covered are the Type 1 reports, which are the reports that single establishment contractors file. The other EEO-1 reports, so the Type 3, Type 4, Type 6, and Type 8 reports. So those are the headquarters report, the multi-establishment reports for other establishments, and then for small establishments. So those are not included. As I just mentioned, the pay data component 2 is not covered. And EEO-1 reports for non-federal contractors are also not included. So how did we get here? So the Center for Investigative Reporting had filed a different FOIA request for just a subset of IT subcontractors. And OFCCP had initially denied it. And the Center for Investigative Reporting brought a court case, and they brought it in the Northern District of California. That's where it is here. OFCCP lost that case. And then a federal contractor tried to appeal it, and the appeal was dismissed on a technicality. So the appeals court did not reach the decision on whether this data is non-exempt under FOIA. So that is the only case out there right now specifically addressing the EEO-1 reports. So OFCCP then provided notice about the FOIA request for the rest of the federal contractors. And the deadline was initially in September. It's been extended. It's extended to October 19th. If contractors want to object, they must object by October 19th. And OFCCP has listed 5 questions that should be addressed in any objection. And they've also provided a web portal that contractors can submit their objections through. So thank you, everybody. That concludes our webinar, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you to our speakers for that fantastic presentation. Before we end the session, we are launching a quick poll. Please let us know if you are interested in having a conversation with the DCI sales team. Additionally, we will be sending a follow-up email with more resources and a link to the ongoing webinar schedule. Thank you for joining, and we hope to see you again soon.